Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. This video will explore the Second Punic War with an emphasis on Carthage. Although we cannot completely ascertain the Punic perspective on the conflict given the limitations of our sources, by considering the institutions and culture of Carthage, we can hopefully illuminate to some limited extent the logic which drove Punic decision-making during the last 2 decades of the 3rd century BCE. Carthage's norms and practices, as well as its material resources, were critical factors when we are trying to determine what Punic politicians and generals were thinking, and then judging how realistic their expectations actually were. As such, this video is also intended to serve as a primer for the upcoming tier list ranking Carthaginian commanders from the Second Punic War. Before we consider the men who commanded the polyglot Punic forces, we need to establish the context of the war, the political situation in Carthage, and the material and institutional constraints which held back the success of Carthaginian generals. Carthage had been a major power in the Western Mediterranean for a few centuries prior to the First Punic War. The city's power and wealth was based on a combination of the fertile farmlands of North Africa and Carthage's trade network, which stretched across and beyond the Mediterranean. Establishing hegemony over other Phoenician colonies in the east, the Carthaginians put themselves at the center of a trade empire in the Western Mediterranean, with lucrative links to the Phoenician homeland in the Levant. The Carthaginians also engaged in a voluminous trade with the Etruscans, the prosperous northern neighbors of the Romans. The presence of so many opportunities in the Mediterranean meant that the Carthaginians were by no means systematic about subjugating the hinterlands of Africa, although they did conquer the local Libyans and established a hegemonic relationship with the Kingdom of Numidia. Our knowledge of Carthage's political system is fragmentary and relies upon accounts by Greek and Roman outsiders. However, Aristotle and Polybius paint a portrait of a state which was not unlike the Roman Republic. Carthage had a body of ruling aristocrats which was very similar to the Senate in that it deliberated and passed laws and resolutions. Although Rome had citizens' assemblies, and they were still relatively strong during the 3rd century, Polybius insists that the common citizens of Carthage exercised far more power over the city's affairs than the commoners of Rome. Polybius, who took up and developed Plato's idea of a constitutional cycle, whereby good forms of constitutions degenerate into bad forms before shifting into a good form of a new system, believed that Rome's triumph over Carthage during the First and Second Punic War owed at least in part to Rome being a mix of aristocracy and democracy, whereas Carthage, which was older, was more of a mixture of oligarchy and mob rule. Greek political theory aside, it is clear that just as was the case in Rome, Carthage could and did bend its political norms under the pressures of war, probably taking just as many curious and unprecedented measures as the Romans. Aristotle, whose earlier comments in the Politics are less detailed but also less tendentious and moralizing, paints a picture of Carthage as something not too far removed from the Roman Republic. Aristotle's acolytes composed detailed constitutional histories of many polities, but sadly only the work on Athens has survived to the present. Livy, writing in the time of Augustus, seems content with the assumption that Carthage's government was more or less the mirror image of Rome's, with the Senate composed of aristocrats presiding over a large urban population which was able to make itself known through its assemblies. As in Rome, Carthage elected 2 senior politicians each year who were the chief magistrates. The Suefites originated as judges, but then their powers evolved over the course of Carthaginian history. Although they started out more akin to Rome's praetors, they became the equivalent of the consuls by the time that Carthage and Rome collided. One Suefete typically commanded forces in the field, while the other presided over the government in the city. As with the Roman consuls, the Suefetes were members of the Senate and typically sought and followed the advice of their colleagues. Another similarity between Suefetes and consuls is that the office seems to have been reserved in fact, if not in theory, for only the most well-born and well-financed members of the political elite. The Carthaginian Senate was called the Drum, which means the Great Ones, one of the more grandiose titles for a ruling council. Generally speaking, the suffetes and the Senate were on the same page, as was also typically the case in Rome. All of the men who assembled to debate the affairs of state shared class interest, had approximately the same education, and adhered to the same traditions, so one has to imagine that consensus was not terribly difficult to achieve. The Council of 104, originally a judicial body, effectively dominated domestic politics as it had acquired sweeping powers by the late 3rd century. The precise relationship between the Senate and the Council of 104 is not entirely clear, however. When there were disagreements, whether those disagreements arose between the two suffetes or between the suffetes and the Senate, the issue would be referred to the People's Assembly, which seems to have held a referendum function. Thus, in contrast to Polybius's claim, there was nothing particularly resembling mob rule in Carthage, nor anything resembling democracy. As for the details of Carthage's relationship with its colonies, and in particular with Barcid Spain, we simply do not have enough information to explain precisely how the Carthaginians understood such arrangements. During the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, while Rome was in her infancy, Carthage was establishing its claim to mastery in the Western Mediterranean. In surviving Greek and Roman histories, the Carthaginians first attracted the interest of historians with their campaigns in Sicily. The primary geopolitical adversary that the Carthaginians had to contend with were the Greeks of the West. The fortunes of the Carthaginians and the Greeks waxed and waned from decade to decade until the early 3rd century. Although they were politically disunited, the Greeks did have the ability to come together when needed to deny the Carthaginians control of Sicily. The pattern was that the Carthaginians would work with some Greeks against others, gain ground over a number of years, and then either win or threaten to win a major victory which would change things dramatically. This would then alarm the Greeks, who would then temporarily unite under Syracuse. When they united, the Greeks would typically roll back the hard-won gains of the Carthaginians rapidly, but would then fall short of driving them from the island, as mutual distrust would lead to the dissolution of the coalition and the outbreak of another period of internecine Greek warfare and consequent Punic recovery. The last great Greek coalition was headed by Pyrrhus of Epirus, who accepted the newly created throne of Greek Sicily. Arriving with his excellent Epirote army, Pyrrhus lifted the siege of Syracuse in 278. By 276, Pyrrhus had captured all of Carthage's holdings except for its main base at Lilybaeum. Lilybaeum, however, had excellent fortifications and proved to be more resilient than the Greeks had anticipated. After failing to capture the city solely from the landward side, King Pyrrhus asked for additional contributions from his subjects, and when they dragged their feet, he resorted to compulsion, and thus lost most of his support. With the Greek threat relieved, the Carthaginians recovered much more quickly than they had in the past, and it looked like there was a very real chance of the Carthaginians finally conquering the whole of the island. However, in 264, the Romans intervened on behalf of the city of Messana and allied itself with Syracuse, thus beginning the First Punic War, which would rage for the next 23 years. Operating ostensibly on behalf of its Syracusan ally, the Romans quickly rolled up all of the gains that Carthage had made since the time of King Pyrrhus. After just a couple of years, the Carthaginian landward presence had been mostly confined to the vicinity of Lilybaeum. However, much of the First Punic War was fought at sea, and in this arena the Carthaginians were supreme at this time. Not only was Carthage home to many seaborne traders, but it also had perhaps the most efficient navy in the world at that point in time. Punic sailors and navigators had the reputation of being the most accomplished and daring, with some of them exploring far beyond the confines of the Mediterranean. By contrast, while Rome's army was excellent, it had only a limited fleet going into the war, and next to no naval tradition. Ultimately, a combination of dogged determination and ingenuity on the part of the Romans, and the indiscriminate cruelty of the sea, negated the chief advantage of the Carthaginians. Hiring shipwrights from its Greek subjects in southern Italy, Rome hastily constructed a full battle fleet of quinquiremes, the standard warship of the Hellenistic period, and set out to challenge the Carthaginians. Unlike Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, which had sought to combat the Athenians on their own terms, the Romans had no intention of trying to beat the Carthaginians in a contest of seamanship. Rather, they developed a device called the corvus, which enabled them to clamp onto another ship and hold it in place for a boarding action. Ever practical, the Romans did their utmost to turn naval battles into land battles. During early clashes, the Carthaginians were taken off guard by this Roman device and lost the bulk of its battle fleet. Although they eventually replaced the ships, the Carthaginians would never again float an experienced flotilla, and without the qualitative edge that they had counted on, they would now struggle to keep up with the Romans and provide communication and transportation between Carthage and its bases. The war at sea would prove to be especially bloody due to the lack of experience on the part of sailors and commanders on both sides. Even when the Romans won great naval battles, they frequently found their victories undermined by storms, where they would lose many of the men and ships who had just prevailed in a battle. Not only did the Carthaginians struggle to compete at sea, but they, too, lost at least one fleet to a storm themselves, a particularly painful fact given the pre-war quality of the navy. What made Carthage's defeat at sea, with all of its attendant casualties, so devastating is that most of the men in the navy were common citizens. Whereas Carthaginian armies largely consisted of foreign mercenaries, mostly from subject peoples, the fleet was a citizen endeavor. This division between Carthage's land and sea forces, and the subsequent setbacks on land and catastrophe at sea, had three important results. First, the people and Senate of Carthage became even more cautious about prosecuting the war. Second, without the fleet, Punic trade suffered, and without that fleet, there was less money to hire more mercenaries to defend Sicily and Sardinia. Third, since Carthaginian citizens generally only served at sea, very few citizens had military experience on land, although there is some evidence that citizens did receive some rudimentary infantry training. The war dragged on for longer than it should have, given the hopelessness of Carthage's position. It was only the poor decision-making and bad luck of the Romans which allowed them to struggle forward. Carthage had a few competent commanders during the war, but it was only in the last few years that a truly great general emerged from the pack, Hannibal Barca. Commanding in the vicinity of Lilybaeum in the war's waning years, Hannibal established himself as a hero in a city desperate for anyone who could reliably put together a victory. When the First Punic War came to an end in 241, the Romans were in an especially punitive mood. Imposing a huge indemnity on Carthage, capping her fleet at a very small size, and expelling her from Sicily altogether, the Romans hoped to keep Carthage weak for a generation, while their own power increased and their naval efficiency improved. Carthage was also compelled to remove all of its mercenaries from Sicily to Africa. After promising the mercenaries that they would pay them what they were owed before discharging them, the Carthaginians found that the war indemnity had left them without the resources to pay off their hired help. Gathered in large numbers in Africa, the mercenaries revolted to try to seize their pay in kind. The Carthaginians, for their part, armed the citizenry and took to the field. The mutual hatred that each side in this conflict held for the other is perfectly reflected in one of the names of the war: the Truceless War. In the end, Carthage turned to Hannibal Barca, and he delivered the city from the danger posed by the mercenaries. As soon as the war was won, Carthage reverted to relying almost exclusively on foreign mercenaries to man its armies. The Truceless or mercenary war raged on, and while it was ongoing, a revolt broke out in Sardinia, where the locals booted out the garrison. Although the population of the island was not entirely Punic, there were many Carthaginians and their descendants living there, especially in the coastal cities. Rome agreed to officially intervene on behalf of the ousted garrison, but this led to a diplomatic protest from the Carthaginians. Citing the Treaty of Lutatius, they claimed that Sardinia was theirs, as it had been for some 300 years. The Romans, however, said that Carthaginian military preparations to retake the island were clearly an act of aggression against Rome, and that if Carthage wanted to avoid war, it had no choice but to pay an additional indemnity and relinquish all claims to the island. Too weak to risk a renewed struggle, Carthage acquiesced. Riding high in Carthaginian politics, and enjoying strong support among both the common people and the aristocracy, Hamilcar Barca proposed taking an army to Iberia. Here, he said, they could provide political leadership to the scattered Phoenician and Greek trading settlements and move from there into the hinterlands to get their hands on the region's fabulous mineral wealth. They could then use this newly acquired wealth to pay off the war indemnity and develop a basis for Punic power to replace the naval trade empire that the Romans had smashed. Despite some strong opposition from an Africa First politician called Hanno the Great, Hamilcar got the commission he sought and set out for Iberia, marching overland and crossing at the Straits of Gibraltar. Despite stiff opposition from the local Iberian tribes, Hamilcar slowly carved out something of an empire in southern Spain. The disunited Celtiberian tribes lacked the individual strength or collective organizational skills to dislodge the Carthaginians, but they were skillful enough in war to make life difficult for Hamilcar and his followers. Under Hamilcar's leadership, the Carthaginians carved out enough space in Spain to allow for significant mining operations. These mines allowed Hamilcar to mint coins of the highest quality featuring Melkart, the Phoenician Heracles or Hercules, and to begin to pay back the war debt to Rome. When Hamilcar died in battle in 228, the leadership of Carthage's Spanish army and province fell to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal the Fair was an experienced commander and politician who had been a close political ally of Hamilcar for many years. Although his succession as Hamilcar's son-in-law could be seen as a Barcid succession, Hasdrubal the Fair most likely had political clout in his own right back in Carthage, and the recognition of his accession maintained the notion that he was acting as an appointee of the Senate and people of Carthage. Lacking both the military skill and aggression of Hamilcar, Hasdrubal the Fair typically preferred to rely upon diplomacy whenever possible. This means that in all likelihood, he was willing to entrust a good deal of military responsibility to his 19-year-old brother-in-law, Hannibal Barca. Hasdrubal should not be mistaken as a mere placeholder, however. During his tenure, he oversaw the construction of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, which became the Barcid capital. Hasdrubal the Fair was every bit as independent-minded as Hamilcar had been, continuing to pay the war indemnity but keeping most of the mining income for himself and his army. It was only in 221, a mere 3 years before the start of the war, that Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a native Iberian leader, thus leading to the accession of Hannibal Barca, who was then only 26 years old. There is reason to suspect that Hamilcar, Hasdrubal the Fair, and Hannibal all chose to send only minimal financial support back to Carthage. The Melkart coins that the Barcids minted were high quality and pure, whereas most of what was in circulation in Carthage at this time was heavily debased. Of course, silver coins were used mostly for hiring mercenaries, so perhaps the Barcids were only acting in a strictly rational manner. At any rate, the Barcids clearly did enjoy a good deal of independence at this time. The relationship between the Barcids and their political opponents, especially Hanno the Great, had always been tense, but with the elevation of Hannibal, it came close to an open breach. Upon Hannibal's succession, the People's Assembly, prompted by Barcid political allies, approved. The ties between the Carthaginians in Spain and the local tribes were mostly personal, and Hannibal, who had been abroad continuously since the age of 9, was the only person who could both inherit those ties and command the loyalty of the polyglot army. Hanno the Great, however, fulminated against Hannibal's ambition and his independence, saying that the young man would one day prove to be a tyrant and elevate himself to kingship. Opposing another war against Rome, Hanno thought that Carthage could best avoid Rome's ire and rebuild her strength by increasing cultivation and control in Africa, a place where Rome had hitherto staked no claim. Hanno the Great was unable to stop Hannibal from taking over in Spain, but he did apparently succeed in getting the Carthaginians to focus on strengthening their hold in Africa. Archaeological evidence shows that cultivation in Punic territory increased during this period. By the start of the war, the Carthaginians had also reestablished a firm grip over both their Libyan subjects and the Numidian client kings. The contemporary sources we have on Hanno the Great all portray him from a distinctly pro-Hannibal or Rome-centric viewpoint, and therefore show him in a negative light. Far from being a jealous, close-minded dimwit devoid of the strategic sense to recognize Hannibal's achievement in Italy, Hanno the Great was a man who was politically savvy and possessed his own clear vision of how to survive and win the war. Despite his hostility towards Hannibal and the Barcids in general, Hanno the Great was not just a partisan hack, although to be clear, he was a strong partisan of his Africa First policy and of promoting the power of the Senate as a whole against the Barcids. It might be more accurate to see him as a Carthaginian Fabius the Delayer, just without the military skill, rather than as some simple-minded but implacable foe of the Barcids. Hanno played a role in reassigning reinforcements away from Hannibal and toward other theaters, although he always had defensible reasons for doing so, even if these troops may have been better utilized by Hannibal. Hannibal resumed the more aggressive policy of his father and continued to advance north toward along the Mediterranean coast of Iberia. The primary Barcid interest in the area, the mines in the south, were secure, but pushing back nearby tribes would only enhance the security and profitability of the province. In an earlier treaty, Carthage and Rome had set the northern extent of Punic influence at the river Ebro, so Hannibal probably assumed that he had several more years to expand and consolidate before he would risk coming into conflict with the Romans. Rome, however, having recently subdued Illyria and northern Italy, felt that it had a free hand to deal with what it saw as the rising threat of Barcid Spain. As was the Roman way, Rome looked for a pretext and issued an ultimatum deliberately designed to be unacceptable to the other side. In this case, the Romans chose to form an alliance with the city of Saguntum, well to the south of the Ebro. Hannibal initiated his siege of the city prior to the formation of this alliance, and as the siege was nearing its conclusion, Roman envoys arrived claiming that Hannibal was in violation of the treaty and needed to fall back immediately. Hannibal, however, had a mercenary army to keep satisfied, and he recognized that the Romans were eager for war and that accepting their terms now would undermine his authority and put him in a weaker position when the Romans eventually did force him into open hostilities. Hannibal seems to have made his decision independently, without consulting Carthage. Despite the hostility of Hanno the Great and others, the Senate in Carthage, which did have a strong pro-Barcid faction, voted to back up their western commander-in-chief. The Roman Senate voted for war and planned to go on a two-front offensive in the spring of 218. One consul was slated to campaign in Spain, and the other was assigned to invade the Carthaginian homeland. While Carthage now had dozens of warships, it did not possess a navy with the numbers or quality needed to stop the Romans from deploying at will. Thus, any war with Rome promised to be a land-based affair, since Carthage had no realistic prospect of reclaiming control of the sea. On land, Rome had been largely unstained by defeat since the departure of Pyrrhus over 50 years earlier. To face the full force of Rome's infantry from a defensive posture, especially in North Africa, which lacks the kind of rugged terrain which helps to bolster the defender, was sure to prove to be a losing strategy. Most contemporary observers, Roman, Punic, and otherwise, probably did not see any real alternative to facing Rome on its own terms. Hannibal, however, had a plan for throwing off Rome's designs. To ensure the loyalty of Spain, he demanded hostages from all of the tribes south of the Ebro and kept them under guard at Saguntum. Carthage's hold in Iberia was based very heavily upon fear, and both Hannibal and his brothers would prove to be adept at utilizing that fear to defend their core territories. Gathering an army of about 60,000 men in early 218, Hannibal planned to cross the Pyrenees into Gaul, and from there to cross the Alps and take the fight into Italy. This bold march, with all of its attendant struggles and heavy casualties, allowed Hannibal to establish himself in northern Italy with his 26,000 or so remaining troops. Despite the relatively small size of this force and the almost non-existent reinforcements from Spain and Africa, Hannibal Barca would maintain a presence in Italy, building around this core for the next 15 years. Hannibal's strategy was effectively to inflict on the Romans the kind of unraveling that he himself feared might happen to Carthage and Spain. Rome's conquest of northern Italy had only been accomplished within the last few years, and in southern Italy, the Greeks had only been subjugated in the 270s and 260s. Hannibal's hope was to pose as a liberator from Roman oppression, playing up the inequalities between Roman citizens as opposed to Latins, as opposed to Italians. By supporting rebellions across Italy, Hannibal thought that he could cripple Rome's control of Italy and offset its incredible manpower advantage. Despite the objections of some modern critics who see Hannibal's dive into Italy as reckless, this does not seem to be a strategy which Hannibal thought out in advance. As soon as he arrived, Hannibal began to target the potential discontented peoples of Italy with messages tailored specifically to their grievances. In the north, he promised the Gauls renewed independence. In Campania, which had become a playground for the Roman rich, he promised the proud city of Capua regional hegemony. Among the Greeks of the south, Hannibal posed as a successor to Pyrrhus and the realization of Western stories about Heracles. Playing into his family's old association with Melkart and using his deep knowledge of Greek culture to good effect, Hannibal established a firm following in the Greek-dominated regions of Apulia and Bruttium, which would be the final areas he held in Italy prior to his departure. As for northern Italy, the Gauls both achieved independence and provided men for Hannibal's army, but he never fully succeeded in mustering or mastering the considerable manpower of this region. From the immediate aftermath of Cannae until the final years of the war, both Hannibal and the Senate at Carthage dreamt of establishing one of Hannibal's brothers in northern Italy to create a pincer with which to squeeze the life out of Rome. However, the Romans proved to be far more effective at stopping Hasdrubal and Mago Barca than they were at dealing with Hannibal. Hasdrubal's efforts to establish himself in the north ended in a catastrophe at the Metaurus in 207, and while Mago did land in the north late in the war, he was contained and defeated. Hannibal's strategy was brilliant, and his execution was extraordinary in terms of his operational and tactical performance. However, he was ultimately overwhelmed by the resources and resilience of Rome. It has become something of a truism that Hannibal's chief mistake was underestimating Rome, and perhaps there is something to that. However, I am more of the opinion that he overestimated the strength of his own side. As I shall explain, commanding the kinds of armies that Carthage fielded was not an easy task, and Hannibal, who was accustomed to interacting with foreigners, had a great deal of command experience, and possessed military genius, perhaps did not realize that what came so easily to him was a taller task for other men. Carthage, as I mentioned above, relied upon mercenary forces. While some of the men in the ranks were more loyal than others, the loyalty of most of the men in any given Punic force relied upon either the promise of pay, the fear of losing family members who were being held hostage, or both of those things. Only the most charismatic and successful commanders were able to earn a deeper commitment from their men. The land armies of Carthage were polyglot and lacked standardized tactics and equipment, and they also lacked a single shared language for issuing commands. Different contingents were commanded using different arrangements. Some forces, such as the Numidians, fought under the command of their own native leaders, whereas other mercenary contingents were commanded by Punic officers. Often, as we shall see, the unit commanders were able to establish rapport with their men and acquit themselves well. It was far less frequently the case that army or theater commanders on the Carthaginian side won any distinction. In Hannibal's hands, these polyglot forces were a weapon, a multi-tool, and Hannibal both saw and realized the potential of each component of his army, getting the full use out of each unit through his acquaintance with the strengths and weaknesses of his men, and his knowledge of how they would behave in battle. Other commanders, including his two brothers who shared his upbringing and experience, never achieved anything remotely resembling comparable results. By contrast, Rome's system at this time was based on mass conscription. Roman, Latin, and allied farmers were called up in varying numbers each year based on need. Despite lacking the professionalism of the standing legions after the Marian reforms, Rome's conscript armies were uniform in their approach to war, and a good number of the men in the ranks possessed considerable experience. Rome's manipular armies put poorer men out front as skirmishers, velites, with young men serving in the first main line, hastati. Backing up the hastati were the principes, men who were a bit older and more experienced. In the rear, the oldest men, the triarii, used long spears, and their role was to serve as the last line of defense, to either allow the other men to rally, or, if need be, to stand and die, and allow the men who were still fathering future generations to live on in order to fight and breed another day. By the late 3rd century BCE, the Romans were in the practice of digging a standardized marching camp each and every night. If our sources are to be believed, no Roman marching camp was ever overwhelmed by a foreign foe. Although the Italian allies had grievances and some cities did defect, the Romans and Latins remained rock solid in their fealty to Rome, even during the darkest hours of the war. Rome also utilized fear to keep its allies in line, but it mixed that with some real material benefits, such as sharing war booty. While the Romans and their allies could field a respectable number of cavalry, the quality was never on par with the horsemen of Gaul or Numidia. However, the combination of Rome's simple but effective infantry organization and its deep manpower pool proved to be a winning formula. The genius of the Roman system is that it did not require commanders to be geniuses. Roman commanders, unlike Athenian generals of the 4th century or Carthage's best generals, were amateurs by design, and the system was catered to their limited skill and experience. All things being equal, a Roman commander with several years of non-consecutive experience under his belt could command just enough respect to fight in the open and let his men use their numbers and training to smash the enemy. Even when the commanding praetor or consul was in over his head, the Roman system, where elites were required to serve several years as a military tribune prior to running for office, provided enough experience to bring out the military talent of enough men that there was usually someone in the command tent who knew how to solve simple military problems. Many Roman commanders were successful, and very few of them were military geniuses. While Rome did produce an occasional military genius, the real military genius of Rome was the system itself, which led them to victory over the military traditions of their Italian neighbors, the Gauls, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians, the Seleucids, the Parthians, the Illyrians, the Celtiberian tribes, and almost everyone else they ever encountered. To put it bluntly, when Rome lost an army and a consul, it was not a cataclysmic event. There were more men waiting in the wings with identical equipment and who were as capable as the men who had fallen. The Senate could furnish another magistrate, and if the situation demanded it, even go so far as to send someone with a proven track record of success. Carthage could also replace defeated forces by hiring more men. However, finding the accomplished commanders its armies needed was extraordinarily difficult. Mercenaries who were talented were not always readily available. More importantly, recreating a strong bond between foreign mercenaries and Punic generals was not easy and required time. Carthaginian coins were effective at building armies, but unless those armies had the time to cohere and Punic generals had time to establish a bond with their men, these armies were exceedingly unlikely to defeat the Romans on the field of battle. The stereotypical view of Carthage's generals in the Second Punic War is effectively that Carthage had a military genius in Hannibal, a few decent officers, and a bunch of scrubs. When I explore the various Carthaginian commanders in my upcoming tier list, I hope to show that while Carthage only had one Hannibal Barca, there were institutional factors which made it very difficult for Punic armies to defeat Roman armies. The Punic side produced some able and dedicated leaders who were not intrinsically worse than their Roman counterparts. Carthage's defeat and Rome's victory owed a good deal to wartime contingencies, but at a deeper level, the conflict was decided before it was fought, as Rome's military arrangements and manpower pool were simply superior.